It's from Germany, the new leader of Germany. He has a cool mustache and he's trying to take over the world and needs friends. This also got forwarded to Italy. They all decided to be friends because they had so much in common. It's time for World War II.
Allies turn the tide in Europe, sections 1 through 5. Europe first. As the Americans had a threat in the Pacific, they saw a greater threat in the European theater, so they decided to approach one problem at a time and face Germany and Italy before moving on to the Japanese. They used many of their resources to subdue Nazi Germany, and over time they defeated them. The Yalta Conference, February 1945. The Allies met in Crimea next to Yalta to discuss Germany's defeat and plans for moving forward. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill were all present at the meeting. They discussed goals for the final strategy of the war, the rearrangement of the post-European map, and the future security and safety of the liberated people from post-Nazi Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was a major turning point when the Soviets and Allies pushed back against the German forces. The reason the Nazis wanted to capture Stalingrad was it was located close to crucial oil fields that were necessary to fuel the Luftwaffe. North Africa and the Battle of El Alamein. Britain won a key battle at El Alamein. The Allies landed in Morocco and Algeria. Dwight Eisenhower, aka Ike, was the leader of the Allied forces. General Erwin Rommel was the leader of the Nazi forces and tried to attack them with his Afrika Korps, but couldn't defeat the Allies. Normandy and the D-Day invasion. 21 American divisions, 26 British, Canadian, and Polish divisions struck the beaches at Normandy, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Set up fake headquarters in southeast England, and a fake attack on Calais. Hitler sends top tank division to Calais instead of Normandy. June 6, 1944, 11,000 planes used to soften the beaches in Normandy, and first troops land at 6:30 a.m.
Essential condition that underwrote the success of D-Day was the fact that Germany had been bled virtually to death by fighting on the Eastern Front for several years against the Red Army in the Soviet Union before D-Day ever happened.
The Germans had been preparing for this invasion as long as the Americans and the British had been, and they had been digging in. And they knew that they could inflict appalling casualties on the first units ashore. Well, somebody had to do it. And so the soldiers went, and indeed, those first units did suffer very high rates of death and woundings.
Allies turned the tides in Europe. Battle of the Bulge. The last German counterattack, which involved sabotaging of the maps and town signs to confuse the Allies long enough for the Germans to penetrate Allied lines with heavy artillery. This would be the final German offensive on the Western Front. The attack surprised the Allied forces because of the weather. They couldn't exploit their air superiority. The Germans had English-speaking spies dressed in Allied uniforms and sabotaged the Allied communications. This would be in 1944 of December.
During the Bulge, command broke down, supplies broke down, morale broke down, communications broke down, everything broke down. It was every man for himself. We were inadequately clothed. We didn't have rubber overshoes. We didn't have overcoats. We didn't have gloves. We didn't have scarves. My boots were so bad, I would strip newspapers and drapery off of these bombed out houses and wrap my feet in it. You were having trouble breathing because the snow was suffocating you. And consequently, we lost a lot of men who froze to death.
Operation Valkyrie. This was a German World War II emergency continuity of government operations plan. This was issued to the Territorial Reserve Army of Germany, and their job was to execute and implement in case of a general breakdown in civil order of the nation. Failure of maintaining control of civil affairs equaled Allied bombing of German cities or uprising of millions of foreign laborers working in German factories. The leaders of Operation Valkyrie were General Friedrich Oldbrich, Major General Henning von Troskau, and Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. They modified the plan, using it to take control of German cities, to disarm the SS, and arrest the Nazi leadership once Hitler has been assassinated. But unfortunately, this plot had failed.
Do you like this? Do you like this? Well, no more.
Berlin and its collapse. Hitler's suicide. The Battle of Berlin, also known as the Fall of Berlin. This was the final major offensive of the European theater of World War II. Following the Vistula Order offensive of January through February 1945, the Red Army had temporarily halted on a line 60 kilometers east of Berlin. On the 9th of March, Germany established its defense plan for the city with Operation Clausewitz. The first defensive preparations at the outskirts of Berlin were made on the 20th of March under the newly appointed commander of Army Group Vistula, General Gotthard Heinrichy. When the Soviet offensives resumed on the 16th of April, two Soviet fronts, which were army groups, attacked Berlin from the east and south, while a third outrun German forces positioned at the north of Berlin. Before the main battle in Berlin commenced, the Red Army encircled the city after successful battles of Seelow Heights and Halby. And on April 20th, 1945, Hitler's birthday, the first Belarusian front led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, advancing from the east and north, started shelling Berlin's city center, while Marshal Ivan Konev's first Ukrainian front broke through Army Group Center and advanced towards the southern suburbs of Berlin. On the 23rd of April, General Helmuth Weldling assumed command of the forces within Berlin. The garrison consisted of several depleted and disorganized Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS divisions, along with poorly trained Volkssturm and Hitler Youth members. Over the course of the next week, the Red Army gradually took the entire city. Before the battle was over, Hitler and several of his followers killed themselves, and the city's garrison surrendered on the 2nd of May, but fighting continued to the northwest, west, and southwest of the city until the end of the war in Europe on the 8th of May, or the 9th of May, according to the Soviet Union, as some German units fought westward so that they could surrender to the Western Allies rather than to the Soviets. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945. He passes away after 4 terms in office, which leaves Vice President Harry S. Truman in charge. VE Day on May 7th, 1945. VE Day stands for Victory in Europe Day. This is celebrating the surrender of Germany after the suicide of Hitler during the Battle of Berlin. Unconditional surrender. A surrender in which no guarantees are given to the surrendering party. General Alfred Jold signs the unconditional surrender of all German forces. He hoped to limit the terms, but Eisenhower demanded a complete surrender from Germany. Potsdam Conference in July 1945. This conference was held near Berlin. Consisted of the Big Three, which were Harry S. Truman, Winston Churchill, and then his successor Clement Attlee, and Joseph Stalin. They all established a Council of Foreign Ministers and a Central Allied Control Council. This was for the administration of Germany. They had various agreements, which were on Germany's economy, punishment for war criminals, and land boundaries and reparations. The Big Three also issued a declaration demanding unconditional surrender from Japan.
Saturation bombing, also known as carpet bombing, was a type of strategic aerial bombing done in a progressive manner to inflict damage in every part of a selected area of land. It was usually achieved by dropping many unguided bombs onto the area. It was first used during the Spanish Civil War by the German Condor Legion against Republican infantry during the Battle of El Mazuco. During World War II, Warsaw was the first city to be hit by saturation bombing in the European theater. The next case of bombing was during the Rotterdam Blitz by 90 bombers of the German Air Force during the invasion of the Netherlands. Most of the city was destroyed and nearly 900 civilians were killed and left 30,000 people homeless. Destructive success of the bombing led to the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe to threaten to destroy the city of Utrecht if the Dutch government did not surrender. The Dutch surrendered the next morning. The Battle of Britain developed from fight for air supremacy to a strategic aerial bombing of London, Coventry, and other British cities. The British built the RAF Bomber Command, which was capable of launching many thousands of tons of bombs onto a single target in spite of heavy initial bomber casualties in 1940. The bomber force was then led by Arthur Travers Harris to try break German morale and cause DDay to surrender. The United States joined the war, and the USAAF greatly enforced the campaign in bringing the 8th Air Force into the European theater. Many cities were virtually destroyed by Allied bombing. Carpet bombing was also used as close air support or as flying artillery for ground operations. The first successful use of the technique was at the end of the Tunisia campaign. Led by Sir Arthur Tedder, it was later remembered as Tedder's Carpet. During the Pacific War, carpet bombing was used extensively in highly populated Japanese areas, such as Tokyo. Starting on the night of the 9th of March 1945, going into the 10th, 334 B-29 Super Fortress heavy bombers were directed to attack the most heavily populated sector. A heavy bombardment of incendiary bombs, which was similar to the number of U.S. casualties on the entire Pacific theater. Another 100,000 to 1 million Japanese were left homeless. These attacks were followed by similar ones against Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya as well, where over 9,373 tons of incendiary bombs were dropped on both civilian and military targets. By the time of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bombers were being directed to bomb targets of convenience, as most urban areas had been already destroyed. In the 9-month civilian bombing campaign, over 400,000 Japanese civilians were killed. Strategic bombing, known as a military strategy used in total war with the goal of defeating the enemy by destroying morale or economic ability to produce and transport materials to the theaters of military operations. It was the sustained aerial attack on railways, harbors, cities, workers' housing, and industrial districts in enemy territory during World War II. It is a military strategy which is distinct from both close air support of ground forces and tactical air power. During World War II, it was thought that major victories could be won by attacking industrial and political targets, rather than only military targets. Strategic bombing often involved bombing areas inhabited by civilians, and some campaigns were deliberately designed to target civilian populations in order to terrorize and disrupt their usual activities. The Tuskegee Airmen, the popular name of a group of all African American military pilots during the war. They formed the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Forces. Though there are legends that they had never lost a single bomber, there were actually reports that contradicts this, where the airmen had lost 25 bombers. They were all black military pilots who attended Tuskegee University and trained in the United States at Moton Field. The group included 5 Haitians from the Haitian Air Force and 1 pilot from Trinidad. Though the group trained with North American B-25 Mitchell bombers, they never served in combat and were not trusted to simply because of their color. The 99th Fighter Squadron was the first black flying squadron, and the first to deploy overseas, first to Africa in 1943 and later to Sicily and Italy. The 99th Fighter Squadron initially used Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighter bomber aircraft. The 332nd Fighter Group and its 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons were given Bell P-39 Airacobras for initial combat missions. Later with Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, and finally with the NA P-51 aircraft, with which they became the most commonly associated with. When the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group painted the tails of their P-51s red, they coined the nickname of Red Tails. The red markings that distinguish the Tuskegee Airmen included red bands on the noses of P-51s as well as their red rudder. The P-51B and D Mustangs flew with similar color schemes with red propeller spinners, yellow wing bands, and all red tail surfaces.
The end of the war in the Pacific. The Manhattan Project. Albert Einstein gave the United States the idea of starting the Manhattan Project from a letter he wrote to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Manhattan Project was the code name for the United States government's atomic bomb. This project was started in April of 1942 by Franklin Roosevelt. The Manhattan Project was mainly worked on in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The U.S. started the Manhattan Project because they feared the Germans were creating an atomic bomb. This project cost several $billions and employed tens of thousands of people. The leaders of the project were Leslie Groves and J. Robert Oppenheimer, and many scientists from the United States and other immigrants, like Enrico Fermi from Europe, worked on the project. The Manhattan Project was first tested on July 16, 1945, and Oppenheimer and Groves said that the bombs would, quote, end the war against Japan. President Truman. President Harry Truman became President of the United States after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. President Truman was informed of the German surrender in May 1945. Truman knew the Axis powers had nuclear scientists but didn't know their progress in creating their atomic bomb. President Truman was also informed of the Japanese surrender on August 10, 1945 and August 14, 1945. President Truman approved the Manhattan Project and the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima, August 6, 1945 at 9:14 a.m. The little boy bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. There was a huge amount of damage and death over 5 square miles in Hiroshima. 60,000 people of the 340,000 population were dead or missing within 2 minutes of the explosion. Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945. Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria on the same day as the Fat Man bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan. It was the site of a torpedo building plant. The Fat Man bomb destroyed more than 3 square miles of the city, and another 35,000 people were dead from the bomb. The United Nations. The United Nations was first coined by FDR on January 1st, 1942. In April 1945, delegates meet in San Francisco to write the United Nations Charter, and it was officially created on October 24th, 1945. The United Nations Charter would be ratified by the United States Senate. Many would hope this succeeded where the League of Nations failed. The United Nations made its permanent home in New York, and the United States, Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union are permanent Security Council leaders of the United Nations. Superpowers. Prior to World War II, the main superpowers were Great Britain, France, and the United States. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union are the only superpowers. Stalin, Truman, and Clement Attlee meet in Potsdam to discuss the future of the world and to also avoid another war.
The bomber force was then led by Arthur Travers Harris The bomber force was then led by massive bombing was concentrated a few kilometers by a few hundred meters deep, closely coordinated with advance of Allied troops. I feel like we should redo that. On the night of, in just one night, over 100,000 people burned to death from a heavy bombardment of, I don't know what that. Another 100,000. These attacks were followed by similar ones against Kobe, Osaka, and what? Oh, where over 9,370,700 million. By the time of the drop in, as most urban areas had been already.
Go ahead.
It is a military strategy which is distinct from both close air support of ground forces. Could only be won by attacking. Strategic bombing often involved bombing areas inhabited by. They formed the 300. Though there are legends that the airmen were all black military pilots who trained in the United States, trained at What? I wrote this sentence so bad. I'll just start over. They were all black military pilots who trained in the United States and trusted to, and were not trusted to. Was the first black flying plane. Initially used Curtiss P-40 of their P-51's red. They coined the P-51 really with red propeller.
And it was started. Manhattan Project, Manhattan Project cost several billions. Hiroshima, August 6, 1949 at 9:14 a.m. A huge amount of damage and death was over. Nagasaki. In April of 1945, delegates meet. In April of 1945, delegates. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union are the only superpowers. Stalin, Truman, and Clement Attlee meet in Potsdam to discuss.
Who, because of what the? This was a German World War II emergency continue. Oh my. Failure of maintaining control of civil affairs equaled Allied bombing of Germany. Failure of maintaining control of civil affairs equals son of a and this was a major final son of a well Mark what Franklin Delano Roosevelt's death in April 12 Potsdam Conference on July and they all established a council of foreign ministers and a central Allied control council and lounge.
Getting on the internet and checking in who can get up. Fresh out, start walking, a little bit of humble, a little bit of cautious, somewhere between like Rocky and Cosby's when again, no, y'all can't show me.